For a long time, for decades, the West has used international law, the rider of human rights violations, to beat other states, African states, Middle Eastern states, also non-democratic states across the world, with saying, look, we're the champions of human rights, we do everything right, you guys don't do anything wrong, before we can do anything with you, you have to do this. But it's becoming very clear that that was all nonsense. For me, it's the longest single human rights violation that's happened systematically with impunity in human history since the 40s, if not before that. And we are seeing the rise of the global south, and we're seeing the rise of alternative mechanisms for accountability. Not in a million years did anybody think that South Africa would trigger the Genocide Convention. Not in a million years, but it did. We all wanted somebody to do it. The West should have done it, but it didn't. If the work I do prevents one person from being harmed, one person from dying, then that's success.
Welcome to this episode of Expert Witness, a podcast on the intersection of international law, human rights, and public policy. Today, my guest is Tayab Ali, an outspoken British human rights lawyer and the director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. Tayab Ali's ICJP is among the leading global initiatives seeking justice for victims of alleged Israeli war crimes in Gaza and the West Bank. On 18 March, the group also announced the launch of Global 195, a worldwide legal coalition dedicated to holding accountable Israeli and dual national individuals alleged to have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. We will now be joined by Tayab to learn about his new initiative, his past work, and the challenges facing legal efforts for accountability and prosecuting war crimes before the British justice system and internationally. Tayab Ali, welcome to Middle East Eye and Expert Witness podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. First, could we begin by talking about your latest initiative, Global 195?
So Global 195 is a very important initiative, and it's part of ICJP's Justice for Gaza campaign. And I think in order to put Global 195 into its context, I need to talk about the Justice for Gaza campaign, which we started in early October 23, shortly after October the 7th. But before it became very clear what Israel was doing, in fact, in Gaza. Unfortunately for those of us in ICJP that were working on Palestinian rights issues, it was very clear that without any sort of cause, Israel was prepared to kill lots of people in the West Bank, in Gaza anyway. And clearly, after October the 7th, with the movement of Palestinians into Israeli territory and the capturing of Israeli citizens and also the killing of a number of Israeli citizens, it was very clear that Israel would not allow that to pass without some form of, if you like, response, specifically because it was such a big issue for them. And unfortunately, at ICJP, we recognize that Israel's antecedents, its track record, would suggest that the action it would take would not be proportionate. It would be an act of brutal, ruthless vengeance, which would probably, along with Israel's modus operandi, be a systematic form of collective punishment against the entirety of the Palestinian people. I remember on the 9th of October 2023, I actually did a speech about October the 7th and what I foreshadowed would happen. And in that, I think the estimate I gave was about 100,000 people would probably die as a result of Israel's attack on Gaza. And unfortunately, it looks like that number was probably about right, if not even potentially an underestimate. So we decided at the ICJP to start a program of collating evidence in relation to what happened in the ground in Israel and also in Gaza, with a view to collecting evidence for use in legal proceedings. Obviously, it's been much easier to do that, although it's difficult to do, but easier to do it with regards to Gaza, harder to do with regards to Israel, because Israel very carefully controls who goes in and what they look at with regards to what's happening or what happened on the ground there, although that would be effectively within the mandate, if you like. And so fast forwarding to now, that exercise, that ICJP exercise, has gathered over 140 witness statements from victims and witnesses, eyewitnesses, on a standard which is equivalent to that which Scotland Yard would collect, so a very high criminal standard. We've used proper criminal investigation protocols, which means that evidence would be admissible in almost any court in the world, including the ICC, the ICJ, any ad hoc tribunal, but also in British courts and domestic courts across the world. We get to where we are now, which is months and months, over a year later, year and a half later. And we see how governments and institutions have dealt with the situation in Gaza in particular. And it's I don't know if using the word not satisfactory even comes close to what the position is. But it's a huge violation of the duty of states and investigative organizations and accountability institutions. And so we saw that we had some progress. Of course, the ICJ issued provisional measures with regards to allegation of genocide. The ICC issued arrest warrants for Palestinians as well as Israelis. And that was some progress, but the reaction from states was appalling. So you have the United States issue sanctions against the ICC. You have people ridicule the ICJ's rulings and misinterpret them on purpose, including the former president of the ICJ taking it on herself to try to interpret a panel of judges, which is not appropriate at all. And we are sitting there in ICJP with this evidence, which has been used by the ICC, it's been used by the ICJ, it's been used by domestic courts, it's currently being considered to some degree by Scotland Yard in complaints that we've already submitted. And we're worried that the people that are supposed to be doing the accountability exercises are not doing it, or not prepared to do it, or unable or incapable, or being prevented from doing it. And the people inside ICJP, well, we felt a profound duty, not just in terms of investigating, but also in terms of a duty and an obligation for our witnesses. And these people had been in Gaza. Some of them are injured beyond anything that you could probably imagine. Some of them were professionals that risked their life to give medical aid or humanitarian aid to people inside the war zone during the war, in circumstances where they literally would disappear into a hospital and be left to their own devices and had no contact with the outside world. So we felt a bit of an obligation to them that we couldn't just let this record of information and evidence that we have, which told a very clear narrative of war crimes, tells a very clear narrative of war crimes, just sit in our office, in our databases, sit in investigation accountability institutions that aren't prepared to do anything with it. And we decided that we needed to do something with that narrative. And that's the birth of Global 195. Global 195 because there are 195 countries in the world, including Israel, Palestine, Vatican City. And we decided that we would launch our own accountability exercise. And so what Global 195 does, using the evidence we've gathered and are continuing to gather, is first of all, the ambition is to create a legal network across the globe in all 195 countries. And that legal network will utilize our evidence and our legal arguments that have been drafted by leading counsel, very senior counsel from the UK and across the world, supplying that to legal teams in their own jurisdictions for them to make complaints, criminal complaints, to their own law enforcement agency. So step one is to ensure that every law enforcement agency, domestic law enforcement agency across the globe is aware of what is happening in Gaza and what's happened in Gaza and who's responsible for it, because that will trigger law enforcement obligations on those individual law enforcement agencies. Now, the second step is a little bit beyond relying on state agencies, because for whatever political reason, for whatever lobbying reason, for whatever fear reason, states are reluctant to follow their own law sometimes and their obligations and their duty to investigate and prosecute war criminals. And so using this civilian infrastructure, civil society groups, leading lawyers, we decided to effectively take, if you like, the law into our own hands. And we decided that in jurisdictions that will allow it, we will apply for private arrest warrants for individuals that have suspicion around them for perpetrating war crimes. And when I say individuals, we're talking about everybody from Netanyahu at the very top to the political class, the military class, commanders, generals, all the way down to IDF individual soldiers. And so what we are in the process of doing with our legal teams is creating that network and that net, which will capture information about individuals that are in various jurisdictions, and then on the one hand, make a complaint to the local law enforcement agency, the police, hoping they will investigate. And if they don't, or even if they do, apply for local arrest warrants so that you can conduct a private prosecution if the jurisdiction allows it. And that way, you see, we have less reliance on the ICC, less reliance on governments, because what you then create is effectively a civilian worldwide ICC, International Criminal Court. And you then meet, and actually, if we meet our ambition of 195 states, it will be wider. The net will be wider than even the ICC has got, because the ICC only now has 124 countries. Now that Hungary's left, it did have 125 until a couple of weeks ago. And so our reach potentially is would potentially be far wider than even that of the ICC. And something else that we can do, and we did this in Romania just a couple of weeks ago, for example, is we became aware of an IDF soldier on the ground in Romania. And as it happens, we didn't have a legal team in Romania, but within 24 hours, our legal team, our global legal team, was able to find, secure, instruct a local lawyer to prepare a criminal complaint to the police, which was lodged with the police with respect to an individual that was in that jurisdiction. And that complaint is ongoing, and we're in discussions with the Romanian police about that, and will continue to be through our local lawyer in the jurisdiction. But that's an example of how Global 195 can be very reactive, in a way that governments will not be, in a way that political legal institutions aren't being, and potentially can't be, and are prevented from doing that.
And you mentioned that you have 140 witness testimonies as your evidence, and that this meets the evidential standards for the evidentiary standard for the ICC and for other courts. How is that? Could you explain?
Sure. So I mean, it's a little bit to do with ICJP and where ICJP came from. So the ICJP is the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, and that was really incubating since 2009, when I was involved in a legal team in London, where we examined the processes that lawyers had been using to apply for private arrest warrants in war criminal cases. And we successfully obtained an arrest warrant for Tzipi Livni, the former Israeli foreign minister, in Westminster, in a London magistrates court. And the London magistrates court issued that warrant based on this very specific process. And so if you imagine, I am effectively a criminal defense lawyer, that's my training, which means that I've been working with police or in opposition to police and the Crown Prosecution Service in criminal cases in the UK, defending people that have been accused of criminal acts, all the way from low-level thefts all the way up to the most serious murders and terrorism and that type of allegation. But at the same time, part of my practice involved in preparing complaints, domestic level complaints about all sorts of regular criminal acts on behalf of clients, and submitting that to the police. And even in some occasions, going to court on behalf of these individuals to apply for arrest summons and warrants. And understanding the way that the Counterterrorism Command police work, which houses, by the way, the war crimes unit within it, or the war crimes team within it, understanding how they work was a really useful exercise for me, because it meant that we could replicate their techniques in collecting evidence. And so one, just as an example, we create multi-layered packets of evidence. And what that means is that if we have a witness, we don't pre-interview any of our witnesses. It's a really important step. So we don't ask them who they are, what they're doing, where they were. We say, look, you have some evidence you want to give to us, no problem. What's it about generally? Or it's about something that happened to me in Gaza. Okay, fine. We make an arrangement for them to come into a room where we have video cameras. They sit down. and we literally talk to them on camera. And that's a technique called ABE, attaining best evidence. And so you video record the person's first account and recollection of what happened. And the technique to do, you have to be trained in this process. The person that's interviewing the individual will start chronologically at the beginning of their story or their narrative, take it all the way through to the end. But you add to that some really important evidence. You add to that video recording photographs that they took on their camera. If you download them or secure them from the device in a forensic way, you geolocate and time and record the time and data from that. So you know where they were, where the photograph was taken, what time it was taken. And that's a useful secondary ream of evidence. They have videos which they've recorded about what they saw, what they say they saw. That also is forensically downloaded and kept. They might have social media where they were making contemporaneous comments about what they're now telling you, and that gives you another layer of evidence. So that together becomes your evidence package. And then you add to that, for example, you secure that, you ensure you secure it under proper investigative protocols. And then you might also collect medical records. You might collect other evidence that there may be shrapnel they've got or something like that, photographs of injuries, things like this. You collect all of that, and that produces from that witness a very credible and serious piece of evidence. Now, if you think about doing that across 5 or 6 people in an event, but you think about doing that across 140 people, particularly some of those people are professional witnesses. And what I mean by that these are medical professionals that have been in Gaza for providing humanitarian aid. Now, they see evidence in a way that other people don't see, because they see the results of Israeli attacks. They hear first-hand accounts of what these individuals tell them. So you collate a vast volume of information. What we do with that evidence is we create a timeline. And we add to that timeline open source material that we've collected from Israeli soldiers talking about this on their social media, from just general information that's passing around in the open domain, other people's reports. You add that to the timeline. Now you start to get a really clear picture, minute by minute, in fact, as to what was happening in Gaza and what Israel was doing. And you can locate by separate sections of evidence. For example, I'll give you an example of one of the early discoveries we found. We had photographs from a journalist of soldiers standing by canisters which contained phosphorus. We had separate accounts from doctors that were treating phosphorus injuries in children. And then we had a separate account of the explosions which showed the phosphorus raining down on urban areas, which presented a very clear story. Now, these 3 different pieces of evidence from 3 different groups, but you put them in the timeline, and now all of a sudden you've got the date, you've got the time, and you can connect the dots between where the phosphorus came, who the soldiers were standing next to the phosphorus canisters, and where they were fired, and the injuries they caused to children. And that, if you use phosphorus, for example, in an urban area, that's a war crime. And so now you've built an evidential picture about just one stream. Can you imagine you do that through 140, and that number is continuing to grow because we're continuing to collect evidence. So that tells you a very clear and compelling evidential story about what's happening, which is why when I talk to you about what I see has happened on the ground in Gaza, I'm very confident about what I say because I can prove it.
And over the past 18 months or year and a half, the ICJP has already engaged in war crimes investigations in the UK and globally. Could you talk about that? Could you talk about any war crimes investigations you're part of, those that you submitted to the war crimes unit at the Met Police and others?
So even before October the 7th, we were engaged in collecting evidence as best we could, using the same type of technique, because obviously this technique was learned all the way back in 2009. And we, for example, were submitting complaints to the ICC with regards to our position is the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, a journalist from Al Jazeera, the American Palestinian journalist. And so we submitted complaints with regards to things like that. So we were already doing this work. We submitted complaints to the ICC about the withholding of bodies, about the destruction of heritage sites, the destruction of property. This work was already being engaged with. And post-October the 7th, we I suppose the way to describe it is that the work intensified. And with the evidence that we were now gathering, with the primary evidence that we were now gathering, and that told a very clear story, one of the first complaints that we formally lodged, some of the complaints obviously I'm not going to speak about because they're confidential, but one of the complaints that we lodged was a complaint for complicity in war crimes against 5 British Conservative Party government ministers and officials. So there's and that was in relation to the allegation of starvation and the complicity in that, and the issue of supplying weaponry to Israel in a time when it was very clear that Israel was potentially committing, or in fact committing, war crimes. And so that complaint, that particular complaint, has within it a list of suspects. Suspects include the political class, as I referred to earlier, Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant. If they ever come to this country, there is evidence sitting with the police with regards to those people. Israeli soldiers, including potentially British citizens that are Israeli, have participated in alleged criminal acts in Israel. But more importantly, in terms of for Scotland Yard, the complaint about British citizens, and this is something that's effectively new in the work that we're doing. For a long time, I think people like myself have been slightly misguided or made a mistake or misstepped, because we always go for the primary actor. We always go for the guy that's pulling the trigger. We always go for the person that's ordering the bombs to be fired. But behind that primary action, or that primary actor, is a massive war machine. And that primary actor war machine, that primary actor couldn't do what it needed to do, or it wanted to do, or perpetrate those criminal acts without that complicit support in the background. And so, what we learned, I mean, this came from a client of mine, this philosophy, if you like, because in an investigation I was doing with regards to torture, and my client, he wanted me to find and prosecute somebody that had tortured him. And interestingly, through legal proceedings, and I don't want to identify the proceedings of the individual because it's not fair on them, we identified the person that was responsible for being complicit in his torture, the guy on the ground that was doing this. We identified them. And my client said to me, do you know what? I don't want that person. So I asked, what do you want us to do now? We've got this person. Do you want us to prosecute, sue, what? He said, I don't want you to do anything to that person, because I get that person. I get what they were doing. There will be people higher up than him, right, that told him what to do. They're the people that we want to hold accountable. And I learned that. I learned from that small, tiny, I don't know if it's compassion or principle, but I learned from that we had made a mistake in that we'd always gone for the person that was signing the certificate in the battleground, or pressing the button, or pulling the trigger. But actually we were laying off the hook the people that were complicit in it, the political class in jurisdictions like the United Kingdom that were supporting those war crimes. And we decided to do something different. And the thing we decided to do different was to hold those individuals accountable in their own countries. And that's why we targeted, for legal action and arrest and prosecution, British ministers and the British government. And I'm pretty confident that the British police have a real problem on their hands, because I also don't think they really want to do this from a political position. But they have a problem because we've made it very clear to the police that if they fail to act on the very clear evidence we've got, we will judicially review them. We will then take the police to task for their failure. And something's very interesting, because the Labour Party, when they came into government, they reviewed the weapons licenses that the Conservative government had put in place. And they decided to suspend some of them and withdraw some of them. And this is although it's a very small gesture in the grand scheme of what Britain should be doing. But what does that tell you? It tells you that a proper review of the weapons licenses meant that there would have been knowledge that those weapons could have been used for unlawful acts, which makes it even harder for the police to ignore our complaint against those particular ministers, former ministers. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what the police have to say about our complaint.
You're not considering judicial review against the police anytime soon, right?
We're considering our options as and when they make decisions.
Because the first complaint that you filed was almost over a year ago.
That's right, yeah.
But there hasn't been any prosecution now.
That's right.
So
So why am I waiting so long?
How are you dealing with this delayed action?
The problem with law is it often moves slowly. I know this myself because I know how long it takes me to put a criminal complaint together. So I do have some sympathy with some law enforcement agencies in taking some time, but not the time they're currently taking. I don't have sympathy with that. It couldn't be possible that it took my team, let's say 6 months to draft a complaint, analyze the evidence, and it takes the police a year to read that. I mean, their job is easier, right? A year to consider it. That can't be right. And so one of the things that we're doing now is moving forward in the United Kingdom with our private arrest warrant complaint. And the reason we're doing that is because we can demonstrate to a court that we can't rely or even trust the law enforcement agencies that are meant to be doing this, which is the police, because we've given them something to do. And they haven't got even out of, if you're horse racing terms, they haven't even got out of the box yet, They're still in what they call the scoping exercise. And if they were taking this situation seriously, then they would have got further than that. Now, you compare and contrast that with, for example, the support the ICC gave to the Ukrainian prosecutors in Ukraine with regards to Russian alleged war criminals. Now, there was a war going on. During a war, in a battlefield environment, because the entire of the Ukraine was effectively considered to be a battlefield, they managed to investigate, they managed to arrest, they managed to detain, they managed to prosecute, they managed to convict and imprison war criminals in less time than it's taken Scotland Yard to read my complaint. What does that tell you about the police here? Now, the reason why I'm relatively calm about this is because there is a problem for the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a Rome Statute signatory. It's a member of the ICC. It has obligations on it in order to investigate and prosecute and also prevent, in some circumstances, war crimes and international crimes. Failure to do that is a breach of the Rome Statute, which means the United Kingdom effectively would be seen as failing to investigate and prosecute war criminals in this jurisdiction, which means they could potentially come before the ICC. Now, the ICC is obviously under massive attack. We know this because of the work that it's done. But the Global 195 project becomes very relevant now, because if I have a country, I'm going to use Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is not one of the Global 195 countries at the moment, which is why I use Sri Lanka as an example. It's just a convenient example. If a police officer in Sri Lanka decides that a universal jurisdiction crime has been committed, and they determine that they have the universal jurisdiction power to investigate and prosecute individuals that have violated the Rome Statute, the Geneva Conventions in their jurisdiction, it means that they could potentially issue an arrest warrant for a British citizen, a British politician in their jurisdiction, if they have the will to do it, and then ask for an Interpol red notice and have that person extradited and brought into their state to be prosecuted. Now, the United Kingdom, the politicians in the UK might think that they're comfortable right now because, nothing will happen because they feel they're in a position of power. But, nobody thought the ICC would issue arrest warrants for Israeli politicians, particularly the Prime Minister, and they did. And what I say to politicians, and also Zippy Livni, didn't ever think that a British court would issue an arrest warrant for her. It was impossible in 2009, but it did. And they should remember this. And the point about this is that courts have to act on evidence, and there are rules that they have to apply. And there is no way a Western or a democratic state can control what the court might decide to do, as we've demonstrated time and time again in cases. People are accused of all sorts of political crimes, and sometimes the court finds them not guilty, and it's a surprise to everybody. But that's because that's just this happening. That's the court acting independently of the political class, and that still happens in the UK. And a good example of how we operate in the UK is that in a war crime scenario, I know and I appreciate that the commentary out there is international law doesn't work. There's no accountability. People get away with murder, literally. But let's not forget that during the Iraq War, after lots of pressure from organizations like mine and lawyers like myself, British soldiers were prosecuted for war crimes in Britain and convicted. And let's not forget that happened. The British government paid damages to individuals where it had violated their lives in civil proceedings. That happened. Right now, there is the Special Forces inquiry with regards to the SAS and what it's alleged to have done towards civilians, including women and children, in Afghanistan. Now, the whistleblower for that inquiry were SBS soldiers, other Special Forces soldiers from within the British forces. It didn't come from the outside, it came from inside, because some members of our patriotic British armed forces, or patriotic members of the armed forces, said, this is not the values this is not why I joined the service. And right now there's an inquiry going on into those soldiers. And if the inquiry finds evidence that there were violations of international law, which it sounds like it might, based on the reports we've had from this inquiry, there will be prosecutions into SAS soldiers that potentially violated international law. In England, right now, in this day, in 2025, 2026, that might happen. So are you telling me, or not you particularly, but are people trying to tell me that the British establishment, legal establishment, from the judiciary, the political class, will protect Israeli soldiers over their own? I don't think so. And that's something that people need to remember when they think that law isn't working. It's just slow. It's just rubbish at going quickly. It's rubbish at intervening quickly. That's the politician's job. That's what sanctions are for. That's what the United Nations is for. That's what the General Assembly and the Security Council are for. That's what governments should be doing. That's what the Middle Eastern states should be doing across the whole of the Middle East, across the whole of the Muslim world. They should be looking at what Israel is doing and saying, we can't play with you anymore. No, we're going to sanction you. We're not going to trade with you. We're not going to recognize you. They're not doing that. That's because the political will is missing. But we're not going to allow the legal infrastructure to be ignored. And you've got to understand this as well. You know yourself that governments, allies of Israel, have attacked the ICC for what it has done in issuing arrest warrants. We just think about why that is. It's because they're frightened of the rule of law. They're frightened of the court. They're frightened that if this goes in front of a court, justice might be done. And justice being done in this situation is that Israeli politicians are prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned, but also those complicit in those crimes would be as well, potentially. That's why there's an attack on these institutions. They're not attacking the institutions because the institutions don't work. They're trying to prevent the matter itself being litigated inside a court. And that's an important thing to remember, because if there was so much corruption still inside these legal institutions, the court system, they wouldn't care, would they? They would let the matter go to court, knowing that each person that was put before the court would be found not guilty. But they can't guarantee that. And I know that when the British government tells a foreign government minister, when the foreign government minister says, can I come to the UK, will you protect me? They say, yes, we can try to. We can give you nonsense like special mission immunity and the rest of this. But our courts are independent, our police is independent. We can't guarantee you that safety. And that's the truth. And it's part of the reason why, in order to try to prevent and to protect Benjamin Netanyahu in Hungary, they weren't prepared for the matter to be litigated before a court. So they had to withdraw from the ICC Rome Statute. That's how seriously they take international law and how frightened they are of it. And to be honest with you, they should be frightened of it.
So Tayab, speaking of the prosecutions within the UK, assuming our audience or listeners do not understand the process here of how a war crimes prosecution is carried out, could you walk us through the steps and the challenges as someone who's very experienced in that from decades ago?
So it's the ability for a citizen to approach a court and ask a court to issue a summons or an arrest warrant against a person that's perpetrated a crime against them is a fundamental right in the UK. And it's enshrined in statute and common law. And it happens not just in war crimes, it happens in regular crimes. I mean, for example, if you feel that you have been wronged in terms of a criminal way, somebody's stolen something from you, committed a fraud against you, you make a complaint to the police, and the police either don't have the resources, they don't have the time, they don't believe you, they don't have the will to help you and investigate. And we know that our police is massively under-resourced at the moment in the UK. And it means that you yourself can hire a lawyer. You can go to a magistrate's court with the evidence showing the wrong that's been done, ask the court for a warrant, and the court, if there's sufficient evidence, will grant you that warrant. The difference in a warrant and a summons is this, that if you know where the person lives that you're trying to prosecute, then they will send the summons to their house with a court date to come to the court. If they don't know where the person is, then they'll issue a warrant, give it to the police, and it becomes the police's job to find them. And that's just the simple technical difference between those two things. But so if you investigate people that are supporting Israel under domestic law, which is not universal jurisdiction, then you don't need what we call the Attorney General DPP's permission to prosecute. You can just go to the court, you can apply for an arrest warrant, and you'll get that. And that's something we're looking at closely, but I don't want to go into more detail about that.
That's for British nationals, right?
Well, all of this applies to British citizens and foreign citizens, the same. Now, if you have a crime that's been committed, a Geneva Convention crime, an international crime, the law in this country was changed after Zippy Livni. So what happened is that we managed to get an arrest warrant for Zippy Livni, and the political class, disgustingly and disgracefully and shamefully, decided to move against the ability for people like me to apply for an arrest warrant.
That was in 2009, right?
It took 2 years for them to get the legislative change. And the change that they got was that now, before I apply for an arrest warrant, I have to get the Attorney General's permission. Now, what that means is that suddenly, in a democratic state, you have the separation of powers. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, and they're separate. And the reason they're separate is because they keep an eye on each other. And so if, for example, a prime minister is doing something wrong, he can find himself before the judiciary, and the judiciary can review decisions being made by the executive and legislative. And that's the way that works, and they interpret it. Now, what they did in this situation, in order to, and I'm going to make this really clear, in order to protect people accused of war crimes, not for any other reason, just in order to protect people that might have unlawfully killed men, women, and children during an armed conflict. In order to protect those people and give those people more protection than you and I have in domestic law, they made it the Attorney General's job to give consent to the prosecution before a person like me can go to a court and apply for an arrest warrant. Now, to some degree, that made it a little bit more difficult to apply for an arrest warrant, but it also made it a bit easier, because now the complaint that I submit to the police, it means it's their job. They've got to do it. They can't say, oh, we don't have the resources to, because, well, you haven't a choice. The law's changed to the degree that it's your job to do it now, not my job to do it now. But because the system is not working even in that context, we have decided to take the second step and to actually continue to apply for private arrest warrants. And that will include arrest warrants for war crimes against British citizens and also foreign nationals that come into our jurisdiction. Now, we will have to get the Attorney General's consent. And we have prepared our strategy for that. And I'm prepared to say it because I want them to know. I want the Attorney General to know what we're prepared to do. If we apply for an arrest warrant and the Attorney General is slow, we will judicially review the Attorney General's speed, or lack of speed as it happens, and apply for an interim injunction to prevent the individual from leaving the jurisdiction. Very clear for us. If the judicial, if the Attorney General makes a decision which we think is unlawful or irrational, we will judicially review the Attorney General's decision, all the while applying for an injunction to keep that person in the jurisdiction for when the matter is resolved to be able to prosecute them. There is no scope in this situation for the police, for the government, for the Attorney General to protect war criminals in the UK. There just isn't any scope for that. And we're not prepared to allow that to happen.
Assume like the hypothetical situation of Netanyahu or Gallant or anyone who's suspected of committing war crimes or even has an arrest warrant against them at the ICC. what would happen if they arrive in England?
So there's a difference between what should happen and what would happen, and there's a lot of confusion created by pro-Israel lawyers and lobbyists about what should happen. But I'm very clear about what should happen. If a person with an arrest warrant arrives in a Rome Statute country like the UK, and by the way, just to make this clear for those people that think that they were expelling our sovereignty to the ICC, we're not. We have the International Criminal Courts Act 2001, which allows us to prosecute these people here domestically under domestic law. So we don't have to send them to the ICC if we don't want to. We can prosecute them here if we like. But the point about this is that that individual, that warrant should be executed, which means that the police should be told to go and arrest that individual and detain them and surrender them to the ICC. It's that simple. There is no immunity. There is nothing that trumps that. Not special mission immunity, not head of state immunity, none of that. Now, the reason why I bring those issues up is because there has been argument that if a British court, if a war criminal suspect like Netanyahu arrives in the UK, the government will let the courts deal with it, implying and potentially implying that there is immunity, head of state immunity, because Netanyahu is not an ICC state, and Israel is not an ICC state, and therefore the Rome Statute wouldn't apply in the same way. Well, there is precedent on this, and it was decided by the chamber in the ICC, the appeal chamber. The law is very settled. The part of the ICC International Criminal Court Act which talks about immunity only talks about immunity if there is immunity. The ICC appeal chamber has decided already that head of state immunity does not trump an ICC arrest warrant, which means that the UK court cannot apply immunity to that individual. That would be in breach of the jurisprudence of the ICC, and it would be against the law. And we are prepared to make sure that we litigate that issue in the UK. So if a person came into the UK and a court or an individual was not prepared to execute the ICC arrest warrant because they felt that there was some special status for that individual, either under head of state immunity, special mission immunity, or something like that, we would challenge that in court. We're prepared to challenge that in court. It would be a obligation on us to challenge that in court. Because whilst our government, for political advantage, might want to protect war criminals and might want to actually be complicit with war criminals, the people in this country don't want that to happen. And we don't want that to happen. And we won't allow that to happen.
So you don't expect special mission immunity to be used to protect Netanyahu, for example, or visiting Israeli officials? Because it's been already used to shield them from prosecution.
To shield
almost 60 officials over the past decade have been granted special mission immunity by Britain.
Yeah, so special mission immunity is, as far as I'm concerned, an artificial construct of customary international law. And I was involved in the High Court case, the Gaza case, which where the Court of Appeal decided that actually the customary international practice was that customary international law practice meant that special mission immunity was a thing and would protect that suspected war criminal.
Hijazi is like the Egyptian
trade minister there. And so what was unique about Egypt was during the Rama massacre, General Sisi, President Sisi now, had all the ministers sign effectively a declaration agreeing what action to take, which makes them all joint command control responsible for it. A clever move from anybody that's planning on committing a war crime, because it makes everybody comply with what you want them to do, because they're also culpable, and that's the reason. And anyway, in with regards to that, the fact of the matter, I think, is that we could have and should have gone to the Supreme Court on that case, but we stopped at the Court of Appeal. My view was always that the Court of Appeal erred in its judgment. Unfortunately for my client, they ran out of funds to go further, but this time we're not in that position. And we would challenge special mission immunity all the way to the Supreme Court. And I will tell you this.
Because the Hijazi case is now used as a precedent.
Yeah, and it is a precedent. But if we re-challenge that, we'd want to relook at that. Now, if the position is that, so there's two things. When you talk about the number of people that have come to the UK that have been protected, we know there's Israeli generals coming and meeting with the British government, and there's various other people coming where there's suspicion of potential war crimes, but there isn't an arrest warrant for them at the ICC. So these are two different things. And what we're doing here is we're talking about, on the one hand, the ICC arrest warrant, where immunity would not wash. Now, of course, there is some scope for immunity, head of state immunity. There is some scope for foreign minister immunity and potentially defense minister immunity in some circumstances. But your regular general that comes over here, or your politician that's no longer in government that comes over here under some fake construct of special minister immunity, we would not allow that to wash. There are more countries in the world that don't recognize special minister immunity than do recognize it. So if we're talking about the principle of customary international law, which is the custom that states have and recognize, which formulates a customary practice or law, that's what that effectively means. I don't think that the United Kingdom jurisprudence on that is right, and I'm looking forward to challenging it. I'm actually looking forward to challenging that, to correct a position that I don't think is right in law.
So, Tayab, you've spoken about the Global 195 initiative and the recent action that you've taken for accountability, but your work for prosecuting war crimes has started long before October 7th. As a British lawyer, as an international criminal lawyer, and as also the director of the ICJP. So could you please tell us about that and your previous efforts and how these have transformed after October 7th?
I mean, I think, I am director and founder of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, and sometimes people are a little bit confused about that because I'm not Palestinian. And why is it that that's the vehicle I chose to correct international law violations? And the story goes back quite far to when I was in college, collecting money as part of a charity for victims of war. It was a little bit weird because I wasn't politically aware. I was 16. I wasn't politically aware, 16, 17. Politically aware at all. Wasn't religiously aware particularly either. And it was just a fun thing to do. There were things to do in university, in college. And one of the things was to raise money. I also managed a band in those days as well. So it was quite diverse things. I also tried to be a stand-up comic and hopefully, I think I chose right not to do that, although some people might think that some of what I'm saying is funny. But anyway, and so it was just fun. And when people started to object to us raising money for people abroad, parents of other students, I found that suddenly I was like, what do you mean? And I had to understand that. And that was a really weird turning point.
Raising money for who?
Because we were raising, it was during the Bosnia conflict. And so we were raising money for children in need in the UK, but also for children abroad that were victims of crime and war crimes, or victims of war. It wasn't even war crimes, it was victims of war. Simple. It was kind of open.
Was that in the 1990s?
Yeah. If you're a kid and you're a victim of war, it would be through charity. It would be through NSPCC or something like that. It wasn't even us giving the money to anybody in particular. But the objection was based on where these people were and who these people were. And I found that really disturbing. And that led me on a journey to try to understand what was happening. And I started to research and read about conflicts. I started to look at the conflict that was happening then, which had massive racial overtones to it. It was an ethnic war between two ethnic groups. And I looked at World War II, which was also quite eye-opening. Now, look, when you're a kid in school, as part of your history, you learn about World War II, right? And you're given certain bits of information which are really important, so you know them. You don't understand them, you just know them. You know that Jews died, 6 million, that was bad. You know Nazis were evil, right? And you know that there was something called the French Resistance, and there was the Allied forces, and they fought back, and you watch a few movies, and you see it in a Hollywood way, and you say, wow, we won, great, brilliant. That's effectively what you learn. The only horror stories you learn really in school about the concentration camp, they're the ones that, you really learn about, I suppose. And when I started re-looking at it, because I felt a little bit like it became important, because what was happening in that college with those parents complaining about money going to people, shouldn't be going to people because of who they were, what religion they were, what they looked like, or what country they were in. That to me, in the back of my mind, it resonated with World War II. Nazis wanting to kill people because they wanted a superior race. They killed people because they were Jews, or they were black, or they were disabled, or they were Romani, or whatever they decided was the enemy. And I suddenly started to see things in a different way. And a few numbers sprung to mind, which I had already heard before, but now they meant something different. The first number is 6 million Jews killed for them being Jews. Like, wow, 6 million people died because of their religion. It's like, why would you do that, right? And then the demonization of that group. And then a bigger number, 11 million people died in the concentration camps as a total of the kinds of categories that I've just, because of who they were. And I was, oh my God. But then there was one number that I had to re-look over and over again, and it was the total number of people that died in World War II from all sides. 75 million. 75 million. And I'll tell you, when I saw that number, because I don't remember being taught that in my school. But when I looked at that number, I thought, that is a vast number of people. Doesn't matter if they were Nazis, or they were Allied, or they were Russian, or they were European, or Japanese, or Italian. Just that number of people died. And we did that. And I say we as humanity, we did that to ourselves, to each other, whether we justified it or didn't justify it. And I thought, this is something that didn't happen that long ago. I need to know what we're going to do about that. And why does it still resonate now? Why are people still not able to just say, oh my God, that's a human being, let's just stop them, right? In the Gaza conflict, oh my God, that's a Jewish person. Oh my God, that's an Israeli person. Oh my God, that's a Palestinian person. They're dying. This is really bad. Let's try to stop that. That's not the conversation that's happening right now. It's Israeli Zionists are bad, let's kill them all. And it's Palestinians are bad, the Hamas, let's kill them. That's the conversation. And you see, that tells me we haven't learned a damn thing from World War II. But that made me want to engage in making a difference. And I decided that I wanted to be a politician. I thought, okay, I'm going to get right into the heart of this. I was a little kid, 16 years old, running around in a gorilla suit, collecting money for charities and managing pop bands, local student bands. And I was thinking, I'm going to be prime minister. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get to the top. I'm going to fix this. And I thought, how do you become a politician? I thought, okay, how you become a politician is you become a lawyer, right? Because it teaches you advocacy, critical thinking. And at the time I was doing sciences as my A-levels and I dropped them. I wasn't very good at physics and math, so it was good to get rid of them. And I took English and I retrained myself and I applied for law school and I went all that way. And I chose criminal law because it felt the most fundamental aspect of human interaction, criminal law. Because we all land on a desert island, right? You got a doctor, you got an engineer, you got a lawyer. The lawyer's useless to start with, right? The lawyer's the useless one to start with. But so the doctor's really cool because he can heal people, he can make people feel better, and he can diagnose somebody gets hurt, he can fix them somehow, even without equipment. Engineer's really great because he can build your house and you can start building things. That's really good. A lawyer's sitting there going, oh God, I'm a bit useless here. Can you make me feel better and can I live in your house? But slowly what will happen is as this desert island starts to become, moves forward, the powerful people on that island, because of human nature, because of history, will start to abuse, whether you like it or not, as a general rule, the weaker people. So you'll find that where they have the ability to take the food, to take the best house, to take the doctor's time, they will. And everybody else will be left to one side. And in fact, worst case scenario, as we've learned through history, slavery is a thing, they might even make the weaker people work for them. They might even abuse those weaker people. And that's where society needs rules, the interaction between human beings, to say, well, actually, look, it's all well and good that you're the strong one, and you're the clever one, and you're the one in control, and you're the one with the sharpest knife or the spear, or the biggest weapon. But we're going to build some rules. And that's where the lawyer suddenly comes into his own. He's like, right, look, and what's the first rules he'll make? He's not going to make contract law. It's not the first thing, let's make contract law. Let's make law about how to sell a house. Let's make a will. It's not the first thing the lawyer's going to do. The first thing the lawyer's going to do is say, right, let's talk about how we engage between each other, right? You can't steal from this person. That's a crime. And if you do it, there'll be a punishment. There'll be an accountability structure. You can't murder somebody. You can't take somebody else's wife and just sleep with them because you are stronger than her husband. You can't do that. That's rape. You can't do this. And suddenly, those society rules are embedded in criminal law. And that's the way I saw it. Whether other people agree with me or not, that's the way I saw it. And so I chose criminal law. And then I applied that. And on my journey to becoming the Prime Minister, wanting to become a politician, I had a second awakening, which was a realization that, politicians can't do what I want to do because they're stuck in their parties. They're stuck in their, by their whips, in their policy, in their nonsense to try to secure votes. And I say that because you see how desperate politicians are in the UK now to say the most absurd things, which aren't in the interest of the British people, but they tell you that they are because they are, they're seeing that there's upset and disquiet in the British people because people aren't satisfied about where we are at the moment. And they're manipulating and utilizing that for political power. But that's not making our country better. And it's not making the country safer for each other. It's making more harm. And we saw that with the riots last summer in terms of after the Southport killing. And so I thought, well, I don't want to be a politician like that. And engaging with politicians, I was told, well, when you do this, you can't say this. When you do this, you can't say that. When you do this, you won't be able to do that. And I'm like, well, that's not for me. And I remember one day I was in Parliament, and a politician was ridiculing something that I was saying about, and it was quite a horrible situation. It was about death and war and things like this. And I lost my temper. And I directed my sort of venom at that individual and said, look, how can you say this? Well, I'm talking about people that are dying. Have a look at the photographs. And I handed the photographs to them in this meeting. After that, one of my, if you like, political mentors said to me, Tayab, you've got to be more smooth if you want to be a politician. You can't behave like that. You can't say what you think. And I was like, yeah, this is not for me. And what I found as a consequence of that, which is really interesting, is I'm actually more effective as a lawyer holding politicians to account and telling them that they're making mistakes, telling them that they're violating the law, and saying to them that that's not acceptable. And what I'm finding that politicians are doing is that they have this restricted period of time when they're in politics. Oh, I will do the right thing eventually. I just need to get myself into being, the top guy. Keir Starmer is a good example. He's the top guy now. He's not doing the right thing. Not for anybody, as far as I can see. His approval ratings, even though he's got the massive majority, are the lowest they could possibly, they could get lower, but they're pretty low, right? And you've got politicians in like the Reform Party that are just fear-mongering and pushing hate and pushing hate against Muslims, pushing hate against immigrants in order to look like they're strong, in order to look more powerful, and or to gain votes. And it's connecting with a group of people that are not happy about what's going on. And so for me, I decided to do what I'm doing now. And one of the things that's really interesting here is that this has given me access to politicians across all political parties. So I have quite good relationships with politicians across all political parties. But also, more surprisingly for me as well, I have really good relationships with politicians and diplomats across the world. And sometimes a politician from a different country will ring me and ask me to brief them on something, and I will. And I will tell them what I think. And what's interesting about this is that not so long ago, I initiated some litigation. I don't want to talk about what the litigation is to identify the country. And a politician from that country rang me and said, Tayab, I thought you were our mate. I thought you were our friend. Why are you suing our people in our country? And I said, look, doing this is being your friend. My job is to put you right when you violate the law, or when somebody in your country violates the law, or when your government violates the law. And that I consider that to be a friendly thing to do. I don't consider that to be an unfriendly thing to do or what an enemy would do, because you're wrong in this. And I'm going to show you through your court system that what you're doing is wrong. And what I found is that's quite well received, actually, surprisingly, that it doesn't end the relationship just because they had this preconceived idea that maybe because we've got a relationship, I wouldn't hold them accountable. But that's my job. And when I say hold them accountable, I'm not saying that, like everything that I do in my life is perfect, but I'm talking about through the frame of the law, through the framework of international law, the principles of justice. On that, I can speak confidently as an authority. And on that, I hold not just Israelis to a particular standard, but my work spreads across the globe. I currently have cases in respect of Saudi Arabia, in respect of the Emirates, in respect of Kazakhstan, in respect of Pakistan, in respect of a couple of European countries and a couple of African states. I'm not naming them because I'm not quite in a position where I can talk about it publicly. So it's not, Israel is, in terms of my overall spectrum of work, Israel is a small part of that. And why the ICJP was focused on Palestine is really simple. I started my journey at 16 years old in World War II, right? Palestine, the violations of international law came out as a parallel to the legal infrastructure that we built to protect people from violations that happened in World War II, but continued from that day onwards. It's like two separate rays coming out from the same place. And it's, for me, it's the longest single human rights violation that's happened systematically with impunity in human history since the 40s, if not before that. And for me, solving that problem or working towards solving that problem will mean, if we manage to do it, which I'm pretty confident at some point we will as humanity, it will solve a lot of other problems. It will be a really important lesson. It will be the final lesson to learn after World War II. And where we are right now is that in order to not learn that lesson about Palestine, the rest of the world, the Western world, the powerful part of the Western world, is prepared to destroy the infrastructure that came from World War II. On the backs of 75 million people that died, they're prepared to destroy that infrastructure. And I don't want to be part of that process that helps to dismantle that important development from after World War II. I mean, that would be abhorrent to 6 million Jews, 11 million people in total in the concentration camp, and also 75 million people that I think died for no reason at all.
And speaking of that infrastructure that followed World War II, there was the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and there were the two ad hoc tribunals of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda that ended in convictions. Quite successful compared to what we see now, and the output of the of domestic prosecutions and the ICC. I want to hear your take on Hungary's decision to withdraw from the International Criminal Court. That was on the 3rd of April during a visit by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who himself is subject to an arrest warrant by the court, a binding arrest warrant for Hungary to execute, because it is a member of the Rome Statute that established the court, and it remains a member even if it has decided to withdraw. So I want to hear your take on that. What do you make of the withdrawal in terms of its impact on the court and how the court should react?
Well, I mean, it was a very sad thing that happened. And what's interesting about Viktor Orban and Hungary's decision is that it was a pure political decision. It was a demonstration of where Hungary is as a state, as a democratic state. It's in a position where it's dismantling its democracy, because a fundamental aspect of a democracy is the rule of law. Why would a country want to protect a war criminal under any circumstances? I mean, why wouldn't a country say, well, look, actually, I don't think this guy's a war criminal. Let's have a trial. They could have had it in Hungary, actually. So it wasn't because of the right and wrong of what Netanyahu has done. It's something else. Because if some member of my family is accused of a crime, I can't just pull him out and say, actually, no, he's my brother, and let's not do that. I'd say, well, he's going to have a trial, and we're going to have to put our resources to prove he didn't do it or she didn't do it. And Viktor Orban was not prepared for that to happen. And I think that's because they know the truth of the situation on the ground in Israel and Gaza. Hungary, what's really interesting about this for me is that as part of Global 195, we initiated a legal position on the ground in Hungary, and we instructed lawyers on the ground in Hungary to write to the government to say that if they decided to protect Netanyahu, we would initiate legal proceedings. And then they withdrew, and our legal proceedings fell by the wayside because we decided not to waste our resources in that framework. But what was really telling was that the lawyers that supported our work asked us not to name them because they were worried about reprisals from the government. That tells you a lot about Hungary. And I think what Hungary has done with regards to the Rome Statute and protecting Netanyahu, protecting a suspected war criminal, tells you more about the state of Hungarian democracy and where there is repression of its own people, repression of its political classes, repression of its journalists. And so it doesn't really surprise me that a country like that decided to protect a suspected war criminal. Now, it's incumbent on the states in Europe and around Hungary that have relationships with Hungary to work out for themselves what that means, and members of the Rome Statute. Because you're right, the Hungary is still obligated to deal with the Rome Statute as if it was a member, because it takes 12 months for it to remove itself. I suspect nothing will happen. I just suspect the Rome Statute countries won't do anything to Hungary at the moment. And I suspect that because of the geopolitical situation with regards to Russia and that part of the world, and Trump and that part of the world, in that people are reluctant to take, states are reluctant to take this kind of action at this time. But really, does the European Union, does Europe really consider that a state that behaves in the way that Hungary is behaving is rightfully a member of that group? And I'm not sure it is. But it's for them to do that. Now, they can do lots. They can sanction, they can withdraw trade agreements and so on. But one of the reasons I think they'd be reluctant to do that is it would push Hungary towards Russia significantly. And I think there is a lot of fragility among states in that context. And like I said to you, this is what politicians have to deal with. I'm a lawyer, I don't have to worry about that. My position is straightforward. What Hungary did was disgraceful. It was wrong. It violated the Rome Statute, and currently Hungary has put itself in that position. It's violating international law. It's violating domestic law.
Hungary is not the only European country that has openly defied the arrest warrant decision by the ICC. Also, we've heard from Italy, France, even the Belgian Prime Minister recently declaring that they may not implement the arrest warrant for Netanyahu because he allegedly enjoys immunity under international law because he's a sitting prime minister. What do you make of that, and what's your counter argument to these claims?
I mean, I think they need better lawyers for a start, because that's not right. The Bashir judgment in the ICC makes it very clear that head of state immunity does not trump an ICC arrest warrant. Full stop. That's the position. So these individuals don't have immunity. They've already signed up to this framework. It's already part of the domestic laws in these countries. But what's happening is interesting. For a long time, for decades, the West has used international law, the rider of human rights violations, to beat other states, African states, Middle Eastern states, or to non-democratic states across the world, with saying, look, we're the champions of human rights, we do everything right, you guys don't do anything wrong, before we can do anything with you, you have to do this. But it's becoming very clear that was all nonsense. It's becoming very clear that that wasn't true. It's almost like the little boy said, look, the emperor has no clothes. It's like we've got to that stage. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with the breakdown of international law across Western states, because what that means is that we will all end up with a level playing field, right? If a country across the globe decides that, it wants to take a Belgian ship out of the waters, but international law prevents it from doing it, well, hey, let's just do that. Let's just do that. If we've got the weaponry to do it, let's just do that. Let's just take the cargo. If there's a French interest in an African state, and France is saying, well, we're not respecting international law in our jurisdiction because we're so cool and big and powerful and West, and then, okay, take their assets where they are. That's what happens. These aren't consequences just within France or Belgium or Germany or Italy. These are consequences that span the globe for them. And we've seen also that shackle of international law and human rights law that was so often used to beat other states, the global South states, is really becoming a bit meaningless. It's becoming like a soft weapon. It's almost, you can laugh when America says, you've got a poor human rights record. It's like, shut up. Have you seen yours? Have you seen your allies, right? Where the United Kingdom then starts to express itself as a state that believes in human rights and democratic values, well, you can just point and say, well, but you're supplying weapons to somebody where there's a war crime arrest warrant. We don't have to listen to you anymore. And one African state minister said to me, we're becoming emboldened by this because we're seeing that the shackles that we had from colonialism, the control, the lack of independence is being moved. But what the West is doing is allowing us to remove the economic shackles too. Because all we have to do is assert human rights and assert that we need to comply with human rights. We've signed up to things like the Rome Statute. We've signed up to anti-money laundering and proceeds of crime procedures in our state. So we can't do business with these people anymore. Right? So it's actually helping them to remove these shackles. And we are seeing the rise of the global South, and we're seeing the rise of alternative mechanisms for accountability. Not in a million years did anybody think that South Africa would trigger the Genocide Convention. Not in a million years, but it did. We all wanted somebody to do it. The West should have done it, but it didn't. The United States should have done it, but it didn't. But South Africa did. And there were a lot of people behind South Africa that saw that happen. Well, you know what? Maybe we could do some of that. One African state said to me, and these were the words, we want a silver bullet like South Africa had. We want something as big as the ICJ Genocide Convention case that South Africa did to make our mark. What could we do? And that's a big deal. People in those states are seeing the West for what it is, seeing the West for what it does, but actually the West has a lesson to learn. You're asking me about what happens. Let it break down. Let them break down. Let other states rise as being the leaders for human rights. Let just one Muslim state in the Middle East wake up and say, do you know what? This is right. This is wrong. It doesn't matter what the system of governance is there. I don't really care about that, particularly in this conversation. But there's nothing stopping any Middle Eastern state saying, right, okay, this is international law. This is what human rights are. This is what my gig is now. This is how we're going to have our foreign policy. Because others will follow. And we'll see that development. We're seeing that development happening. And with Trump's recklessness in terms of economic strategy and tariffs, you might see that accelerate. We didn't think that this would happen for 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. It might happen next year, the way that the world is rapidly shifting. You're seeing new alliances. You're seeing people actually speak up for what they want now. We at ICJP have spoken to around over 50 countries now, from head of state, foreign minister, minister of justice, and ambassador level. One country said to me, and I don't want to say who or what, said to me, we are an ally of Israel. We have to be an ally of Israel. We can't move from that position, but can you help us to create something underneath that we can do that supports the Palestinian people? And they then introduced me to NGOs in their country They introduced me to them to say, can you work with these people? Now, that's really telling because, again, that political situation where they have to do certain things as politicians, I don't have to do that as a politician. And so we in that state, they were very clear. We have to be an ally of Israel. We don't agree with what they're doing, but we have to say we do.
Is it a Western state?
I'm not saying anything about it.
Okay.
But it's not a Muslim state.
All right. And speaking of the South Africa genocide case at the International Court of Justice, looking at the trajectory of history since the beginning of international criminal law in the aftermath of the Second World War, do you think it's a watershed moment for the fight against impunity or the struggle for accountability for those breaching fundamental human rights stipulated in conventions like the Genocide Convention and others?
So the ICJ is a really interesting vehicle that we've got. It's the World Court. It's meant to arbitrate between states and disputes. That's what it's meant to do. And I just want to clear up what an advisory opinion is from the ICJ, because people think it's just advice that they can take or not take, and that's not what an advisory opinion is.
That's separate from the South Africa case, right?
It's separate from the South Africa case. So the South Africa case is a dispute between parties, South Africa and Israel. South Africa is saying that Israel has violated the Genocide Convention. South Africa is saying that they have two dual duties, one to prevent genocide and one to punish genocide once it's happened. And so that's the litigation that's going on there. And when that's an important focus and parallel, where the ICJ decides on what in that dispute, that will be binding on Israel, and it will be binding on South Africa, the decision. So that's binding. But when people talk about advisory opinions, they talk about, which really is where a state or the Security Council or General Assembly asks the ICJ to settle a position in law. This is happening, right? Can you advise us what the law says about that situation? And this is really important because what the ICJ has decided is the settled legal position. So what it's advising you on is advising on what the law is. It's not advising you that this is what the law is and you can take it or leave it. It's saying this is what the law is. This is how you apply it. And I'll come to why that's important in a minute. And what is decided with regards to Israel is really important, really significant. In 2024, the ICJ ruled that the occupation was unlawful, that settlements were unlawful, including outposts, that settlements should be deconstructed, that Israel was annexing land unlawfully, that Israel was using settlements to do that Israel carried out acts of apartheid against the Palestinian people in the occupied territories. So apartheid is now a word that is being ruled on. You can use that in the context of Israel. And most importantly, that any state that supported that was violating international law and should not be supporting that. And that's an important context of the ICJ. Now, why that's important is because people say there's no enforcement mechanism. And technically speaking, there isn't. So we've decided all of that. There is no ICJ army that goes out and then says, right, Israel, you've done this wrong, or right, Palestine, you've done this wrong, and this is now what that should be the Security Council doing that. And in a world that worked properly, the Security Council would make sure that the ICJ's judgments were implemented properly, but the Security Council is dysfunctional, General Assembly is relatively dysfunctional. That's fine, right? But what is often missing is that those rulings, including the ruling from the ICJ on provisional measures in terms of genocide, and the ICJ's ruling that there's a plausible risk of genocide because of what Israel is doing, and it had to implement provisional measures to prevent that from happening. And the 2024 ruling that I've just outlined, the way that comes to bite is that when you have domestic legislation about Israel, about investments, about the behavior of companies, corporates, and states, you can refer to the ICJ ruling and say, look, we don't have to debate in this forum whether Palestine is unlawfully occupied. The ICJ law ruling is that it is. So you have to adopt that. And as a member state, it has to adopt that. And where that becomes particularly important is, for example, at the ICJP, we've launched litigation on behalf of Palestinian civilians who have been injured in the attack on Gaza over the last 18 months. A civil personal injury tort claim against British Petroleum for the pipeline in Turkey that supplies Israel with the fuel that it uses to put in fighter jets that then fly over Gaza and kill men, women, and children. And that claim, the basis of the law, apart from being English jurisdictional law and Gaza law potentially, but being a claim in the United Kingdom in the High Court here, the factors that remain to be interpreted will be brought in by ICJ rulings. And that's how that becomes really important. And I think that's also a secondary failure for lawyers around the world, which is that they haven't been doing this regularly. So you got the Wall judgment from a long time ago, and how's it been used? And that's something else ICJP is focused on. We want to make sure that the interpretation of international law, okay, it might not work in the Wild West at state level, interstate level, because they've all got their interests, like we just talked about, Hungary and France and Belgium and Italy. But the domestic courts, they have to look at this. And the reason they have to look at this is because the domestic courts set precedent. And the precedent that they set is really clear, because that precedent will be used in other cases. And so they can't just simply go, oh, well, actually, because this is a Palestine-Israel case, we're going to forget about this. Because lawyers like me will then say, look at this, on this occasion, you didn't do this, and therefore you can't do it now. And that's a really important situation. And the only way that a domestic court can get around that is if the domestic legislative infrastructure breaks down. But if that breaks down, society breaks down, government loses its power entirely, and you end up with riots on the street and so on and so forth. We go back to my desert island example, where you end up with engineers that can build houses, you end up with doctors that might be able to fix you, but you end up with a lot of criminality where those houses are destroyed or taken by the powerful and the rich and the strong, and the doctor is meaningless because he's only allowed to treat the people that are meaning to treat. And some people might say that analogy is actually happening generally in society at the moment, but that will accelerate. And law and order will break down on the ground. And that's why, these principles, when you talk about why they're important, because on a simple level, it's not important. Nobody cares, because I'm all right. I've got an iPhone, I've got a nice car, I've got a nice house. I go to the supermarket, buy more food than my family can eat, right? And throw half of it in the bin. Most people's experience. Generally, the people that make decisions, that's their experience. So we're comfortable. So we don't have to deal with these issues. But that comfort is only there whilst there's law and order and structure. And if you start breaking it down, it doesn't just break down for people in Gaza, it breaks down for people across the globe.
I want to go back to the ICC arrest warrants and the defiance by European states, particularly recently when Netanyahu traveled to Washington to meet President Trump. He flew over the airspace of a number of European countries, including France. What's the law on that? Is it a gray area? Like, is it legal or illegal for them to allow him to fly? Because they are members of the Rome Statute. They are under an obligation to arrest Netanyahu. But in fact, when we reached out to the French Foreign Ministry, we got a claim by a source, a diplomatic source, saying that they have not violated the law and that there's nothing in the Rome Statute that deals with airspace. What's your analysis of that?
I think it's an interesting position, and I've seen other people talking about this as well. But let's just look at it in practical terms. There is not in a million years that if anybody like probably even Hanea, if he was alive still, or Putin, or even Netanyahu or Gallant, are flying over a Rome Statute country, that they're going to scramble jets and have a mid-air confrontation to force the jet to land. Just don't think that's going to happen. I genuinely don't think that's going to happen.
So you think it's intentional for them to allow?
I think on a practical basis, you've got politicians making these decisions. What they're going to do? They're going to let the jet fly, right? And if they try to, they could technically say, don't fly over our airspace. Israel has that kind of impunity that it'd probably do it anyway and not care, not give a damn. I think it's a little bit of a distraction in terms of more interesting question would be if the plane got into problems and it landed in one of those states, what would then happen? And I think that would be probably, I think that any of those countries, France, Belgium, Italy, would find it very difficult to not arrest Netanyahu or Putin or if he happened to be that.
Is it because of the independence of their judiciary? Because politically they have announced that they may grant him immunity.
Look at what you have to do. You can make an announcement all you like, right? But in each of those countries, there's lawyers better than me that are way, way better than me that are ready and waiting. They're waiting. Let's do it. There's this movement across the globe. It's not even the just Global 195 movement. There is a movement across the globe to hold people accountable. People are getting fed up of all of this. And they want to live in safety. They want to live in security. They recognize what the government politicians don't recognize, which is by giving impunity, giving an asymmetrical relationship to one party over another, just leads to violence. It leads to a spiral of violence. Everybody recognizes that. The most unsophisticated person will tell you, if somebody burgles my house and then I ring the police and they go away, the next time they burgle my house, I ring the police and the police don't do anything. The next time they burgle my house, I'm not going to call the police. The next time they burgle my house, I'm going to have a baseball bat ready. That's just common sense for people. That's what people will do. And that creates violence. That's why you have the 999 or the 911 number to call the police, to come round and deal with the issue so you don't have to do it yourself. But if you fail to do it over and over again, people will do it themselves. And the whole point of law, going back again to my desert island analogy, is to prevent the powerful just abusing the weak or the weaker and taking what they want, when they want, how they want. And our governments currently are not understanding that for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they think that, and they've got comfortable themselves, and that they think 5-year term, I'm off, see you later, I can go get a cushy job in a bank or some petroleum company or some humanitarian organization, and then suddenly remember all this stuff about human rights that I couldn't remember while I was in office. And the difference now is I think that these politicians are not going to be able to do that in the way that they thought they could in the past.
Going back to ICC sanctions by President Trump and attacks on the court in general, what was your reaction as someone who works in international criminal law and of course, you've engaged with the ICC over your career. What was your reaction to that when you heard that Trump is sanctioning prosecutor Karim Khan? And do you think the court has responded appropriately?
Fateh Bensouda was also sanctioned by the United States under a different president. So it didn't really surprise me. Trump headlined it, which is what I'm going to do. And he did it. Now, what does that mean? Well, I actually think it's a crime, frankly. Article 70 of the Rome Statute prevents interference with the court and the court's processes. And I think issuing sanctions on the ICC prosecutor is doing exactly that. It's interfering with the course of justice. And therefore, I think it's a criminal act under the Rome Statute. Now, people will have the argument the United States is not a signatory and therefore it doesn't apply to it. But of course, the criminal act is happening, that the base criminal act, the rationale for the sanctions is happening in a Rome Statute state, Palestine. This is why Israel is also susceptible to this, to the ICC's jurisdiction. That's been decided by the ICC court. So you could make the argument quite easily that the United States, when it tries to interfere with that, is violating within the jurisdiction of the ICC. But it goes further than that. If you are an organization, institution, individual within the Rome Statute states, then you probably, and you act on the sanctions, you're probably also in violation of the Rome Statute by Article 70. And so there is, my reaction, so if I was the prosecutor, what would I do? I would be issuing warrants across the globe for people that were supporting those sanctions. I'd be doing quite a lot differently, actually. I would be issuing arrest warrants for complicity, Article 25 complicity in terms of member states. I would be absolutely looking at Article 70 for people that are trying to make complaints about the prosecutor to his bar council in the UK, people that are supporting attacks against the prosecutor, journalists that are publishing interfering articles with the about the prosecutor. All of that is something that I would be doing. Why the ICC is not doing that, I can't speak to. I probably would guess that it's because there's enough to deal with as it is, already. But this happens when you have a prosecutor that makes it their lives up to their mandate, if you like, and decides to go after war criminals or criminals, even organized crime gangs. In Italy, when prosecutors attacked mafia members and leaders, they were under siege. They were turned into like almost like a mini war battle. Prosecutors were scared for their lives in that situation. The same with the cartels in South America, and this is no different to that. This is just a war criminal cartel, a war criminal mafia, and it just happens to be that Israel is currently the head of it. Trump is part of it. Keir Starmer's government is complicit in it. So that's what I think is going on. And I think that it's a duty on law enforcement agencies to intervene there. And as I said to you, we all know where it ends up if they don't. It ends up in a breakdown in order.
And do you think Karim Khan has acted enough or has investigated enough people or issued arrest warrants for enough politicians? Like, since he applied for the arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant in May of 2024, and then the court confirmed or issued the decision to issue the arrest warrant in November of the same year. You have been very outspoken about the delay in confirming the arrest warrants, but now, we are in April 2025, and we haven't seen more indictments. We haven't seen more arrest warrants. Why do you think that's the case? And what would you advise Prosecutor Karim Khan to do at this point?
I measure the delay not in hours, seconds, days, months, years. I measure it in dead bodies. So, as part of the work at ICJP, I receive witness testimony, which tells me how many people have died in that witnesses' network, family, town, situation. When you measure delay in death, then nothing can ever happen fast enough, can it? And so who's culpable for that? Israel. The institutions we created which are dysfunctional. The institutions we created that are being prevented from acting. But most importantly, that criminal cartel or mafiosa that I mentioned, of leaders, politicians that are enabling that impunity for Israel. And that goes from countries that neighbor Israel, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, all across the Gulf, too many to mention. It goes all the way through to Pakistan, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, the United States, Canada, all in the same position. South Africa, the only country so far that is outspoken about what's happening in Gaza. Other states are outspoken about it. The only country that's outspoken and done something about it. And so until we stop the death, which partial credit to Trump for actually managing the ceasefire. He did do that. He stopped that. He did create a ceasefire not so long ago. Netanyahu broke that ceasefire. So why can't the American machine, which appears to be all powerful, re-engaged in it? Is it because they decided that they don't want to be and now they want to be complicit in it? I saw some of the remarks that Trump made when he had Netanyahu in his press conference, and I think Netanyahu looked very uncomfortable. I would love to be a fly on the wall behind the scenes and actually know what's going on, and I kind of measure what's happening with Israel. I get the sense that in the same way as Saddam Hussein was an ally of the West and then he wasn't, in the same way that Gaddafi was an ally of the West and then he wasn't, in the same way that a number of autocratic leaders across the globe were allies of the West and then they weren't, they're expendable. I get this feeling that Israel is the same and Netanyahu is the same. Wouldn't surprise me if suddenly they became expendable. It wouldn't surprise me. I kind of sense some of that going on in the background. I don't know. Maybe wishful thinking. But everybody can do more. But really, before I point a finger at like an individual with a huge mandate like Karim Khan, I'm going to point the finger at governments with armies, like the United Kingdom, governments that supply weapons, the United Kingdom, governments that give political support for Israeli war crimes. That's where the actual accountability is. And then you have, I get criticized a lot for how slow we are. You've been talking about this for 12 months. What have you done? And it's true. And actually, my biggest critic is me, because I haven't done enough as an individual. Because when you measure the lack of action by the number of people that die, and when you get a report today, somebody is playing in Gaza, a child is playing in Gaza. Tomorrow, I know I'm going to get evidence about that child's death. And I get this sent to me on my mobile telephone, probably more than most people, because everybody's like, well, you say you're doing this accountability work. Here you go. Here's this photograph. It wasn't, that person was around, jumping around, playing yesterday. Today they're dead. So I'm not doing enough.
Are you saying the international justice system has failed to protect victims, and particularly Palestinians in Gaza, from ongoing atrocities? Because,
yes,
like in your view, what's the function of international law? Is it just accountability? Is it prevention?
Well, it's both of those things, but the reality is that where you want to prevent something from happening, it's a political decision. It's not really a legal decision. I mean, it's founded in law, but it takes me 10 minutes to tell you what the law says, right? It takes Richard Hermer a couple of days to work out legal advice for the government. He's the Attorney General. But it's for the government to act on that advice. It's for the government not to find, which is what is happening. It's finding a loophole to allow them to continue to be complicit. If we look at that with half an eye closed. I used to think in my naivety when I was very young in the law that where torture happened in places like Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, or a security service officer from whatever country was torturing somebody or killing somebody, that it was often done outside the law, ultra vires, outside the rules, outside the law. And then I realized, actually, there were lawyers sitting in these government departments telling them how they could justify murder, torture, some instances rape, because of political expediency and bogus interpretation of the law. And that was mind-blowing to me, the concept enemy combatant outside the rules. This person is not human. Human rights don't apply. I've seen that argument in my career. And it was mind-blowing for me to think that a lawyer would enable a government or a army to commit war crimes at that level and give legal justification for it, or a minister would sign an immunity certificate. And that's what's happening. And that's why the importance of that level above state is also important. Because when you get a renegade state, you get international law and there's international institutions that hold them accountable. And of course, like I say to you, when the political will is there, it happens blooming fast. Look at the people that are prosecuted in Russian war criminals, prosecuted in Ukraine. I mean, during a war, in a war zone, these people were arrested, detained, and put on trial, prosecuted, convicted, and are in prison. So when the political will is there, justice moves really fast. The problem isn't with the law, it's with the politicians. I hold them personally accountable. I'm a bit sick and tired of politicians saying, well, it's not me. Well, it is you. It's a bit different to a lawyer when a lawyer has instructions to act for their client, because that's the system we've built, and a lawyer is meant to act for their clients without fear or favor. A politician, it's their own mind. They're not working for somebody else's instructions. They're the decision makers in this, and they're making these decisions to be complicit and protect war criminals. That's appalling. It's an appalling position to be in.
So, Tayab, speaking of genocide, do you agree that genocide is happening or has happened in Gaza right now from a legal standpoint? How would you describe that?
So as a lawyer, there hasn't been I can't say there's been a determination by a court of genocide, because there hasn't been. As a lawyer, looking at the evidence that's been presented and collected by my organization and by others, I think there is a clear argument that what is happening on the ground in Gaza is genocide. I think if I was advising a client as to whether or not to bring a claim against Israel on the basis of genocide, I would say, yes, there's sufficient evidence to do so. I think if I was advising the South African legal team whether or not they should trigger the Genocide Convention in the way that they have, I would give an affirmative answer to that, say, yes, you should. And that's really important, and that's the framework. So what do I think? Well, it's very clear to me, looking at the damage done to the humanitarian infrastructure in Gaza, that not just Hamas was targeted, but the infrastructure that gives the ability for people to stay alive was targeted. That's when you attack water facilities, bakeries, food centers, clinics, schools, hospitals, all of that. You are taking away the infrastructure that allows life to exist. I think when you blockade a country, which has happened for weeks now, months now, in respect of Gaza, and you literally do not allow humanitarian aid in, you are causing a systematic violation of the Genocide Convention. I think that when in that framework, when you add those specific acts which are targeted on the Palestinian people in Gaza, and you add to it the rhetoric from very senior politicians, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who invoked biblical scripture of Amalek, which states that you, in this act of vengeance against the Amalek people, which is the word effectively was used for the Palestinians in Gaza, you kill every man, woman, and child, and ox and calf, is beyond attacking Hamas. When Palestinians are described as human animals by senior political leaders, these are clear indicators of intention to commit an act of genocide. So the acts themselves would be war crimes. That's that. And what makes it genocide is the intent attached to those acts and why those acts have taken place. Moving people, trying to move people out of that area is evidence of which supports an allegation of genocide. And so for me, there's that, just on that basic level. Then you've got scholars across the globe, including the Lemkin Institute on Genocide. Why that's important is because it's named after the person, the Jewish lawyer that coined the word genocide, and they consider it to be genocide. You've got Francesca Albanese, who has written reports considering that it's genocide. And then you've got the South African court in January 2024, which is ruling on the issue of genocide because South Africa triggered the Genocide Convention. Two parts of that, as I said, preventing and punishing. And what South Africa argued before the court was that there is sufficient evidence available already by now, by that time, January 2024, that Israel was engaged in acts of genocide against the Palestinian people. And what did the court do? Well, the court didn't make a ruling that there was genocide because that comes later after a trial. So you can say now, as a matter of fact, the status of Israel is that it is a state currently on trial for genocide. That's the fact. And then it also said that when South Africa asked for what we call interim measures, what South Africa was saying to the ICJ is, well, look, we get that the law is slow. We get that it's a long process. We understand that it might be a couple of years before you come to a ruling. But the damage will be done. The Palestinian people, if we're right, will be dead. It will be post-genocide. So there's not much point having a ruling 2 years down the line after the event. So something needs to happen now. And what we want you to do is want you to examine the basic evidence that we've provided to you. So this is evidence of the actual acts, but also the intention that Israel had. And we want you to order Israel and other states to do things to prevent that happening. And they're called interim measures. And the court had to look at that. And the court had certain gateways it had to go through. And one of the gateways is, for example, jurisdiction. Well, first of all, is there a dispute? Well, yes, it ruled there was a dispute between South Africa and Israel. Is the jurisdiction? It ruled that there was jurisdiction. Is this something that the court had the locus, the ability to deal with? Yes, it did, because both South Africa and Israel are members of the UN Charter and signed the Genocide Convention. And that dispute should be dealt with by the ICJ. And then it said, well, okay, let's look at the evidence. Does the evidence tell us that if we don't order interim measures, then if we don't order them, then the Palestinian people will be safe from acts of genocide? And there will be, the harm that's done to them won't be irreparable. So, for example, if we were in a post-war situation, ceasefire situation, permanent cessation of hostility situation, then the court would say, well, nobody's dying now, so we don't need to order interim measures. But what the court decided was that if it didn't order interim measures, then the harm done to the Palestinians at the hands of the Israelis would be irreparable. You couldn't go back in time and fix it. And so it ordered interim measures. And it used the words that the allegation, that what it found was that there was a plausible risk of genocide and therefore a risk of irreparable harm, and therefore interim measures were needed. Now, you can have organizations and Israeli advocacy groups talk till the cows come home about that didn't mean this or that didn't mean that, and you can have the president of the ICJ step out of line and try to interpret a panel judgment in her own view, depending on what was her personal view of or persuasion that she had in that particular moment in time. Highly irregular, highly improper, particularly during proceedings. But the bottom line here is that even the president said that there was a plausible risk of genocide, which would result in irreparable harm, which is why we ordered interim measures. And that's really important. And so that's why I'm very clear in saying, when somebody asks me what's the status of genocide in Gaza, yes, my view, based on the evidence, my legal opinion is that there is a genocide happening. Yes, there is. Nobody's been convicted of it, but there has been a judgment that says there's a plausible risk of genocide, which required the court to intervene to prevent that from happening as a full genocide. That's the position on it. And actually, this is the reason why I've labored to explain this, is because it's actually crystal clear, but there is a lot of noise trying to deconstruct that. And you wonder why there's a lot of noise to try to deconstruct that.
And how do you feel about the UK's reaction to what's going on and the refusal, particularly by Prime Minister Starmer and Foreign Secretary Lamy, to name it a genocide, arguing that the naming of genocide should be determined by a competent court? And even David Lamy said like the scale of killings. It should be much bigger, like the Holocaust or the deaths in Rwanda.
I said to you there's a difference between a politician and a lawyer. Keir Starmer is the best example of that.
Both of them are lawyers, interestingly.
Keir Starmer is a lawyer whose book I read in my own training. Keir Starmer is probably, as a lawyer, the lawyer I would have instructed on a genocide case against Israel. Let that sink in, because that is not the politician you see. And when I was making my decision, he's proof of my decision making. A politician is restricted in what they can do, not by what's right and wrong, not by the law, for political expedience, for a relationship with Israel and the United States. And that's what Keir Starmer is looking at now. Keir Starmer has litigated genocide in a courtroom. Keir Starmer has, before being Prime Minister, Keir Starmer has advocated for Palestinian rights on a platform in his personal capacity. He does not say those things as Prime Minister. So the man that is the lawyer is not the man that is the politician. And for me, for my part, it's the reason why I will not be a politician, and it's a reason why I'm ashamed of our Prime Minister. Somebody that I've instructed in the past as a lawyer.
And speaking of complicity, you've already submitted a complaint a year ago or more with regards to 5 senior British officials that you have not named yet. Has there been any reaction by the Metropolitan Police? What's the status of this complaint right now, and what should we expect in terms of bringing any British officials to justice for aiding and abetting or for complicity, both given the political stance of the UK, but also because of the continued sale or provision of arms or spare parts that continue to sustain Israel's defense industry.
Well, I mean, for the complaint we've put into Scotland Yard, which is part of the criticism I get, people want me to go quicker on it, but it's not my decision, it's the police's decision. They've got the complaint. It's going through the procedural framework, which at the moment is called scoping exercise. So the police are apparently scoping it. Because of the mechanism by which we've delivered our evidence to the police, this is something actually they don't know, but in order for them to access the material that we've given to them, we get a notification because it's in a secure database. And this will form part and parcel of our judicial review when we eventually get to it, as to how long they just sat on the evidence and didn't look at it. So it's been over a year, so they can know that now. I suspect that once this is aired, there may be people in Scotland Yard quickly opening those files and reading them. But I'm quite satisfied that a year is too much delay. They have to carry out their exercise expeditiously and diligently, and they're not doing that. I don't want to reveal our strategy with regards to that, because this is the police's job. They're meant to be scoping. They're meant to be looking at this. They're meant to be acting on it. They don't act on it. There is an accountability structure for the police, which we have in mind, and we will be pursuing. And all I'll say about that is the clock is ticking for them with regards to how much patience we have. In the time they've been sitting on this complaint, tens of thousands of people have died.
Tayib, you've spoken about the efforts to bring Israel accountable before domestic courts and international courts, and you've launched an alliance, a global coalition, to bring suspects of war crimes accountable globally. There is also the Hague Group, which is a group of 9 states launched in January of this year, seeking to hold Israel accountable through collaborative efforts amongst these states that are predominantly from the Global South. Do you think the Global South has a huge role to play right now, given the inaction or even complicity of a number of Western states towards atrocities in Palestine. Do you support this initiative, and do you think the global South provides a better opportunity for holding Israel accountable internationally?
The Hague Group's an important development, but it's not an unexpected development. I mean, it's just sort of the first step in the deconstruction of the value-based system of the West. And so the West was disguising its power-based system, i.e. its armies, with a value-based system. Human rights reports, you'd go to the United States Department to look at the human rights report every single year. They'd say, this country is performing like this country is performing like that. Really a valuable resource. And now you just think, hang on a minute, how are you gonna talk about anybody's human rights record at all? Look at your own human rights record, domestically, internationally. Look at your respect for the rule of law. Look at your respect for your own judiciary. Look at how you're talking about judges in your own country. Look at how you're talking about your opposition politicians. Look at this ridiculous, childish, Hillary Clinton should be in prison, Trump should be in prison. It's like playground nonsense, right? So when as that, it's a symptom of the breakdown of that Western system. It's not great. I live in the West. I want it to be stronger. I want it to be just. I want it to work properly. That's what being a patriot is about. And I consider myself to be a British patriot because I want our system to function properly. I want it to abide by the rule of law. I want it to abide by the principles of justice. But where that breaks down, you leave a vacuum. And that vacuum is going to be filled by other states. And at the moment, it's being filled by states like the group, the new Hague Group, but other states too. And like I said to you, when I'm traveling and I'm speaking to other states, there's a real appetite for review of their own principles, review of their own law, review of their own relationships. And you're going to get to a critical mass point where you've got the Hague Group. That will grow, without a doubt. It will grow. It might even include some Western states in it eventually, right? I wouldn't be surprised if Spain joins it. Despite what the Belgian Prime Minister says, I wouldn't be surprised if Belgium joins it. I wouldn't be surprised if Canada joins it with what's happening with Canada and the United States. But that's what effectively you'll see that potentially grow. You'll see other little groupings like that grow. Now, of course, the Hague Group represents more than just international law accountability. If you get 9 countries that believe in a system of law and rule and construction of it, they'll talk about more than just law and order and accountability. They'll talk about trade. They'll talk about their own arms industries. They'll talk about space race. They'll talk about policing on the ground. They'll talk about intelligence gathering. They'll talk about everything that the West traditionally talks to itself about, Five Eyes. They'll talk about that too, because you've now given them an opportunity to unite around something. And as that grows, I mean, like, who would have thought 10 years ago about the BRICS alliance, for example? And that's growing. And so you're going to not see, it's just a natural development of what was effectively the United States-led unipolar world, where everything was USA, from Hollywood to food, to baseball caps, to sport. Everything was USA. And now you're going to get, and we are getting, and we're seeing the beginning of a multipolar world. You're seeing different centers of power. You're seeing the rise of China, which was obviously predicted a decade ago. You're seeing Russia assert its strength. You're seeing the BRIC alliance say, well, actually, there's a different way. You're seeing the Hague Group say there's a different way. You'll see South American states start to say, well, look, we're not playing this game anymore. And you'll see the rise of these states, which is bad news, if you like, for the West to some degree, but good news for world order, because what you will end up having is a balance. And the balance is important. And where you are at the moment, where all power is centered in the United States, regardless, or it has been for the last few decades, you're suddenly going to get another state saying, well, hang on a minute, no, we don't buy that anymore. You can't build your base here. You can't have that territory. You can't explore, therefore, oil or resources. And we're seeing that, and we'll see that increase, I think. And as we see that increase, you might end up with the Hague Group when it becomes 50 countries, when it becomes 100 countries saying, you know what, we need an international criminal court system. All the criminal court is a treaty. It's all it is. It's nothing special that was created by some magic. It was a bunch of countries getting together and saying, here's a statute, let's all agree to it, and we'll abide by this. And that was great. And that happened in with the Rome Statute. That happened in 125 countries up until recently were members of that state. What's stopping there being an alternative, global South-based international criminal accountability institution similar to that? You might end up with this balance where Western war criminals are prosecuted in the global South and global South war criminals are prosecuted in the West, but it's a balance, isn't it? And as this strengthens, of course, unfortunately, might is still important in this context. But, China's not weak. It's got the biggest army in the world. We don't really know its capabilities. So it hasn't asserted it. It hasn't asserted its military prowess and might yet, but it could. And then you'll get the fracturing of the world order that we have. But, I blame the West for this. Completely I blame the West for it. Because if they had abided by the rules-based system, maybe Russia would have even thought twice about, if you set the precedent, if you commit a war crime, you get arrested and prosecuted. I don't give a damn if you're my mate or not. That's what happens to you. Then people think twice about this. And they genuinely do. After Tzipi Livni's arrest warrant application, I got phone calls from mums of soldiers in Israel saying, my kid has been asked to do this. Would this be a war crime? That's really interesting, isn't it? That's how accountability works. Because suddenly, Israel couldn't protect an Israeli politician from an allegation of war crimes. So people were the rate of no-shows in the IDF is about 50%, my understanding at the moment. 50% of soldiers not turning up to duty. I watched a video of soldiers criticizing other soldiers over this recently. But that's what happens when the rule of law hangs over your head. People start to worry about it. And I think the global South is probably looking, learning, and very, very slowly making itself organized and more powerful. One global South state said to me, we don't have universal jurisdiction in our country. Can you advise us on developing universal jurisdiction principles so that we can look at this issue? We don't have a war crimes legislation in our state. Another state, global South state, said to me, we're thinking, can you advise us on joining the Rome Statute? You lose Hungary, you might gain more, right? And this development, this shift in world order is probably where we're heading. And it might be a good thing overall. Overall, it might be a good thing.
So are you optimistic, or do you still have faith in the global justice system, particularly the Western justice system, where you are based and where you practice, despite the very, very little prosecutions or incidents of convictions? It's been over 18 months. More than 50,000 people in Gaza have been killed throughout the onslaught, and it's ongoing. Is it still worth it to keep waging justice for Gaza as you are doing now?
It's not. It's an obligation, isn't it? I don't have a choice, really. I don't think I could not do what I'm doing. And that goes the same for my phenomenal team, ICJP. Those people are heroes of mine. Very brave, working in sometimes really difficult situations. Sometimes some of the people in the organization that are Palestinian recognize the streets that have been bombed, the people that have been killed, because they're from that region. They're family members in the firing line, literally. So I have confidence in my legal team. I have confidence in the new members, ever-increasing members of Global 195, who are also phenomenal people. The response to it has been amazing. But you know something, right? It doesn't really matter to me what the end result is. To me, it doesn't matter. My obligation is to tread this pathway, and I am, and I will, and I won't stop. And all I'll say about that is that the result's not in my hands. It's really not. When we were applying for the Tzipi Livni arrest warrant, people said to me, "You will never get an arrest warrant for an Israeli," but we did. We did. When I tried to create ICJP, people said, what are you doing? It's like a stupid idea. It will never happen. And now it's a world-leading Palestinian rights organization with global reach. That's what happened with that. When people said, why are you championing the ICC? Because the ICC will never do what it's supposed to do. And I remember sometimes that was a very lonely position to be in. And in conferences where I would say, the ICC will issue an arrest warrant, I am almost certain about it, people would be ridiculing us. I remember meeting with the head of state who literally ridiculed myself and a colleague for saying the ICC will issue arrest warrants, and then they did. When people said the Genocide Convention will never be triggered, I remember posting a tweet about that a state should trigger the Genocide Convention. And then a couple of weeks later, somebody did, but people ridiculed us for that position. And now we've got a ambition to hold Israelis as well as others that are complicit in Israeli alleged war crimes accountable. People still say, you're going too slow, it's never going to happen. It doesn't matter to me if it happens or doesn't happen. My job is to try to make it happen. That's the job of the people in ICC.
How do you measure success in your job?
So one of the things I didn't tell you when I was 16 years old is I wanted a career with an objective in it. And that objective was to prevent harm and stop people dying. That's how I measure my success. If the work I do prevents one person from being harmed, one person from dying, then that's success. I don't have an army, I don't have a government, I don't have a country or a state or an institution, a governmental institution. And so that will always be my objective throughout the rest of my career, to prevent, and I didn't say prevent harm of a particular person or group or individual. I'm talking about for people that are perceived as my friends and people that are perceived as my enemy. I want them to be not harmed and not killed. That's success.
On that note, Tayab, thank you so much for joining us today. I will conclude, although it was a very interesting and informative conversation. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you.